who's a plumber and business owner. We have Larry Stefanik, who's joined us. From the Canadian Labour Congress, we have President Bia Brusk. Welcome, Madam President. And from also joining President Brusk, we have Senior Economist D.T. Cochrane. Welcome. From Canadians for Tax Fairness, researcher and policy analyst, we have Silas Shreb, and I apologize if I mispronounced the name. And from Center for Future Work, economist and director, and no stranger to this committee, we have Jim Stanford joining us. From the Wheat Growers Association, we have its president, Gunter Jokum, I believe is how to pronounce it, but if I get that wrong, please excuse that. And now we are going to hear from the individuals, and we're going to start with Professor Godbout, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to go quite quickly. The increase in capital gains inclusion rate announced in Budget 2024 takes effect 1 week from today, June 25th. For individuals, the change applies only to the portion of capital gains exceeding $250,000 annually. For corporations and trusts, at 66.67% inclusion rate increase applies to the entire realized capital gain. The question is not so much whether capital gains tax reform makes sense in the long run, but the relative benefits of the announced changes outweigh drawbacks, and implementation of that should be favored. That said, let's take a step back to better assess the situation. This is not the first time that capital gains inclusion rate has been raised, nor is it the first time that it has been done in a very short term. So how are the changes made? So not going back too far, in 1971, the bill leading to capital gains taxation was tabled almost 200 days before its implementation, January 1st, in 1979. In 88, the announcement was made in June 87 with the tabling of a white paper 6 months in advance. But they waited 2 weeks before implementing it, and also the bills that were vehicles for it came months afterwards. That isn't like the present situation. However, it was only a few days before the change came into effect in the Notice of Ways and Means motion that was tabled in this budget. If it had had a longer lead time, it would have allowed taxpayers to better plan their affairs. You could say it's similar to the current situation. Let me now turn to a few issues. Clearly, in view of the fact that the Ways and Means motion was only tabled last week, I can say that it does in itself pose a difficulty. But I have identified 4 other issues. For the first issue is flexibility. It would be possible to offer taxpayers a choice to realize capital gains on paper before June 25th without any actual disposition via deemed deposit to oneself. This proposal has been taken up by the Committee on Taxation of the Canadian Bar Association and the Chartered Professional Accountants of Canada, but now it's all too late. That possibility would have given taxpayers more time, considering that the election would be filed and transmitted to the tax authorities to the when the 2024 tax return is filed. That would bring us to early 2025 for the integration of the change. That would apply to rules after June 25. But they would also give a greater chance of fairness to the taxpayers by pushing it further than June 25th. So I think that there would be some advantage in offering a choice like that. Now, here's the second issue, an unintended retroactive effect. Having analyzed the Notice of Ways and Means motion with the tax professionals from the Association Planification Fiscale et Financière in Quebec, I wish to draw your attention to this point. There is a potential of unfair and undoubtedly unintended situation resulting from the manner in which the capital dividend account will be calculated for corporations realizing capital gains during their taxation year, including June 25. I hope that this possible anomaly will be eliminated. The third thing is this. It undermines the principle of integration. By granting $250,000 per year in protection to individuals, a first capital gains, since capital gains have been taxed, we have created an issue of overtaxation. I'm saying that corporations should be offered I'm not saying, rather, that corporations should be offered a $250,000 protection, but I'm pointing out that there is a lack of equality here with respect to the principle of integration. And finally, without saying, there is a problem with indexing and the protection ceiling of a $250,000. That should be indexed, I would think. On that point, I will conclude. Thank you so much, Professor Godbout.
Individual, we have Mr. Stefanik, please. Mr. Stefanik, you may commence.
Okay. Thank you. Hello, my name is Larry Stefanik. I'm 50 years of age, working as a plumber and a business owner in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Thanks for allowing me to be a witness at this committee. I do not reside in their Liberal riding currently. However, I did reach out to the elected Liberals in Manitoba and my elected MP, Marty Morantz. Marty returned my call, and although did not promise I would be a witness, he directed me to this forum to share my thoughts. Thanks very much. Nice meeting you, Marty. I see Terry Duguid is online, which is great because he's a Manitoba Liberal, and hopefully I can talk to him sometime after this meeting. I'm having a hard time understanding why the current capital gains tax is being increased. I started my career in 1992 at the age of 19 as an apprentice plumber working in BC. I was a journey person by 1996 and continued to work and evolve into a supervisor and a manager of a large company until relocating to Manitoba in 2003. Once in Winnipeg, I found employment at a small 6-person service company that I ended up purchasing in 2010. Since then, we have slowly grown to currently employ and support 20 people and their families. Being a worker in the private sector all my life, I soon realized two main things. The harder I work, the better future I would have. Nobody is helping me and my family, so you'd better figure out things for yourself, including savings and investments. Part of this future pension investment by design was to look at the current tax implications in order for me to be financially safe into my retirement. This was not without risk. I had to purchase a business, gain employees, manage my finances, and balance a family. I have been lucky enough to align myself with professionals smarter than me to design a structure of investment so I can create my own pension plan. I understand we all have to pay our share. And I could live with the 50% taxable gain structure, but now I hear it's going up to 66%, and for no reason other than the government needs more money. I'm just a regular everyday person who happens to be a plumber running a business trying to live a good life. Why am I being penalized for hard work? I just do not understand how the current Liberal government got so out of touch with the people. I sit as a board member on the Mechanical Contractors Association of Manitoba. I also belong to a local entrepreneurs group that there's chat around the table. They just don't realize, or why they just can't realize how the government just doesn't realize how we're not rich people. I'm a small, hardworking business owner just living next door. I have to ask the question to myself, why did I work so hard? Why did I risk it all to buy a business? Why didn't I stay a worker, a sole proprietor? That way I would be somehow treated differently. What would be the incentive going forward to the younger generation? If I was a coach or a mentor to a younger, up-and-coming generation, I would have to say, work harder and you can pay more taxes because the government isn't smart enough to make things more efficient, trim waste, and self-innovate. You should look elsewhere to make sure you're living in a place that respects your hard work and a government that realizes honest days pay for honest days work. But at the end of the day, I really think the people we elected should rethink this decision and roll it back. I am frustrated. I feel this is a quick shoot at the hip, no thought for regular everyday people like myself. Thank you for listening. I really hope this makes a difference. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Stefanik. And now we're going to hear from the Canadian Labour Congress and President Bruce, please.
Thank you so much, Chair and committee members. My name is Bea Brusk. I'm the president of the Canadian Labour Congress. The CLC represents national and international unions with more than 3 million members from coast to coast to coast and virtually every sector and industry in this country. I appreciate the opportunity to speak on behalf of this and to let you know that the CLC strongly supports the government's decision to more fairly tax capital gains. Most Canadians would assume that a dollar of income is a dollar of income, whether you earned it at a job or through a productive investment. But that's not the case when it comes to taxes. When you earn your income by flipping burgers, 100% of that income is taxable. But when you earn your income by flipping stocks, only 50% of that income is taxable. We don't think, quite frankly, that that's fair. How can anyone justify that a dollar earned through your hard work should be taxed at a higher rate than a dollar reaped through ownership and investments? Let's look at a real-life example. My first job was at a grocery store. In 2020, in the toughest days of the pandemic, before workers even knew what they were dealing with, we're having to go to work at grocery stores so that we could keep on eating, while many of us had the opportunity to work from home. Those grateful grocery store workers who we are grateful for, bravely working on those front lines, for a few months in 2020, they got an extra $2 per hour in hero pay. Every single cent of that dollar of hero pay was taxed. That same year, a Canadian billionaire bought and sold shares in one of our country's largest forestry companies, netting capital gains of more than $9 million. Only half of that windfall was taxable. That billionaire pocketed $4.5 million tax-free. That's $4.5 million in tax-free capital gains. That's more money than the average worker will see in their lifetime. When we put ourselves in the shoes of the average working person for a minute, we have to understand that that is not fair. Canadians work hard and they pay taxes on their earnings. And those taxes that come off our paychecks, they support the schools for our kids, healthcare for ourselves and our loved ones, roads and public transit, parks, libraries, and every other vital public service that we rely upon. Working people want and need strong, good quality public services. We deserve safe, healthy, and vibrant communities. And we are very much prepared to do our part to support that. What we insist on, however, is that everyone pays their fair share. That income would be treated as income whether you're taxing a worker flipping burgers for a living or a CEO flipping stocks to make millions more. Over the past few years, working people in Canada have struggled to keep up with the rising cost of living, and they know perfectly well that not everybody else is struggling as well. Canadians can see corporate CEOs and wealthy investors profiting from price gouging, and it's extremely frustrating to know that CEOs are ripping off ordinary people while getting preferential tax treatment on top of it. To know that our tax system taxes capital gains more lightly than workers' wages is infuriating. For many workers, the unfairness in the tax system adds insult to injury. Opponents of this important but modest tax change are trying to distract with stories about family farms and family doctors. Make no mistake that the vast majority of untaxed capital gains are collected by people like the billionaire that I mentioned earlier. Canadians know that the rich do not pay their fair share of taxes, and the data proves that. A recent study by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives shows that once all forms of income and taxes are accounted for, those receiving the top 1% of income in this country pay a lower tax rate than those in the bottom 99%. The treatment of capital gains is an important reason for that unfair outcome. And for working people, it's very obvious that we need fair tax rules. Those that have the means need to pay their fair share. Fair taxes for ultra-wealthy are essential for making life more affordable for everyone else, and that's why we support the changes to the capital gains inclusion rate. I urge all parliamentarians to ask themselves a simple question. Do you think it's fair that a worker flipping burgers is taxed on 100% of his or her income, while a CEO making millions from flipping stocks is taxed on only 50% of that income? If you don't think it's fair, then you need to support the small measure of tax fairness. If you do think it's fair, then please do not tell me that you are on the side of working Canadians. Thank you, and we'd be pleased to answer questions.
Thank you, Ms. Brusk. And now we'll hear from the Canadians for Tax Fairness, Silas Shurev.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Canadians for Tax Fairness welcomes this important step to make our tax system more fair. These changes to capital gains taxation will lessen inequality and raise revenue that can be used to fund important public services, new affordable housing, and a just transition. As you're all aware, currently only 50% of capital gains is subject to income tax, while in contrast, 100% of income from employment is taxable. As the Carter Commission noted, this differential taxation leads to, quote, an enormous incentive for the taxpayer to try to transform income gains into capital gains, unquote. This creates uncertainty for taxpayers and inequities in the tax system. This measure would be a step towards closing this loophole. Who currently benefits from the exclusion of 50% of capital gains from taxation? According to data from the Longitudinal Administrative Data Bank, over half of personal capital gains accrue to the top 1% of market income earners each year, and over 1/4 of capital gains accrue to the top 0.1%. This means that the top 1% of income earners benefit over 250 times more from the current reduced inclusion rate on capital gains than the average Canadian. As Ms. Bruce mentioned, a recent report we co-authored with the CCPA showed that when all taxes are taken into account, including sales taxes, these top earners have the lowest tax burden of all Canadians, in part due to this capital gains exemption. This measure also affects the inclusion rate on corporate capital gains, which will be increased to 2/3, and this measure will largely affect the largest corporations. Among non-financial industries, real estate corporations earn the most capital gains. This was over $23 billion in 2022. And so this measure will reduce the incentive for large firms, such as real estate firms, to use their income for passive investments, incentivizing instead investments in new jobs, buildings, machinery, and equipment. Of course, this measure is not new in Canadian history. From 1988 through 2000, the capital gains inclusion rate was at least 2/3, and for most of this period, it was actually 75%. In contrast to concerns being raised that raising the rate could decrease productivity, there was no drop-off in productivity or business investment during this previous period with a higher capital gains inclusion rate. In fact, relative to the early 80s, business investment actually increased during the period with a higher capital gains inclusion rate. Moreover, a recent report showed that rates of labor productivity growth, which are the subject of much discussion today, were higher during the 1990s than they are today, under the lower capital gains inclusion rate. That's not to say that this change is going to increase investment or productivity, just that there's little relation between capital gains rates, tax rates, business investment, and labor productivity. On the other hand, we know that the revenue raised through this measure can be used to fund much needed public investments in housing and a just transition. Award-winning economist Mariana Mazzucato has convincingly shown over the past decade that targeted mission-driven public investment in sectors like renewable energy actually incentivizes private investment in the same sectors. This measure will allow us to democratically decide how and where to direct these much-needed investments. We also know that this measure will, at least to a limited extent, work to combat income inequality, given its targeted nature at top earners. Combating inequality is an important end in and of itself. There is even evidence that income inequality is linked to lower productivity, since low wages can make workers unmotivated. Moreover, decades of research have shown that across countries, higher inequality is correlated with lower life expectancy, higher homicide rates, and more school bullying, among other negative outcomes. We need to remember that the economy is just one part of the larger society we live in. More work needs to be done to address income inequality in Canada and ensure that resources are more equitably distributed, not only through the tax system, but through measures that affect the pre-tax income distribution. However, this change to capital gains taxation is one small step towards improving tax fairness and reducing inequality without a discernible effect on investment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shureb. And now we'll go to Center for Future Work, and Mr. Jim Stanford, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and other members. The 2024 federal budget had three noteworthy features, in my view. First, it allocated modest new resources to several important initiatives, including the school lunch program, affordable housing measures, the rollout of the dental care program, and the new disability benefit. Second, the budget reaffirmed its commitment to previously stated fiscal targets, expressed in terms of a falling ratio of debt to GDP. Third, in order to make those first two add up, the budget also contains some revenue measures, most important the capital gains reforms we're discussing today. I mention this because it's as important in my view to consider what the new fiscal resources are being used for as to consider how they are raised. Those new programs will make Canada a bit fairer and healthier, and the fact that they will be funded with new revenues collected primarily from high-income Canadians by narrowing a lucrative and unfair tax loophole makes this combination of tax reform and the new programs the revenue will be used for a double-barreled boost for fairness in Canada. From my perspective as an economist, let me briefly highlight two important aspects of the capital gains reform. First, the very unequal distribution of the gains and associated tax savings. Second, the lack of connection between capital gains taxation and business capital spending. First, there is no other tax loophole more closely targeted at high-income Canadians than the partial inclusion of capital gains. In 2021, the latest year of Revenue Canada data, 61% of taxable capital gains were claimed by Canadians with total income over $250,000 that year. That group makes up only 1.5% of tax filers, yet claimed 61% of all the taxable capital gains, and an even larger share of the tax benefits from partial inclusion, since they receive higher marginal tax savings than other Canadians. 56% of that group, high-income tax filers, reported capital gains, on average $180,000 each. That was just the taxable part. In contrast, 7/8 of tax filers reported income below $100,000 that year. Less than 10% of them reported any taxable capital gains at all, most of them very small, and combined they received just 15% of all capital gains and an even smaller share of the tax benefits. So capital gains are concentrated precariously among the highest income households, as are the favorable tax benefits offered by the current tax system. The vast majority of Canadians will not be affected directly by this change. Most do not receive capital gains at all, and most of those who do receive gains well under the threshold for the higher inclusion rate. But those Canadians will benefit from the new programs I mentioned that these revenues will help fund. Second, some argue that reducing capital gains exemptions will discourage business capital investment. But the economic evidence shows no connection between capital gains exemptions and rates of business investment in new capital or research or productivity. Canada's business investment, especially in machinery and equipment, has been declining since the 1990s. Business and capital taxes have been significantly reduced in that same time. In the 90s, when the capital gains inclusion rate was 75% and the federal corporate tax rate was 28%, Canadian business invested 5.6% of national GDP in new machinery and equipment. In the last 10 years, with the inclusion rate at 50% and a 15% corporate tax rate, investment averaged 3.5% of GDP, 2 full percentage points of GDP lower. Research and development spending also declined in the same period, as has productivity growth. Many complex factors determine business investment, and reversing this decline is an urgent economic priority. And I have published my own research on the causes and consequences of slow investment. But it is clear that tax factors are at most a second-order determinant of business investment, and it is not credible to blame taxes for the poor performance of Canadian business investment in recent years. Indeed, in some ways, excessively favorable capital gains taxation can undermine corporate investment spending by distorting the choice between different capital structures and encouraging cash flow stripping from corporations. In sum, this reform is important for improving the fairness of Canada's tax system, reducing distortions that encourage tax avoidance and underinvestment, and just as important, will help fund new programs from the federal government that will make a positive difference in the lives of millions of Canadians. I recommend passage of this legislation. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear.
Well, thank you, Mr. Stanford. And now we'll hear from the Wheat Growers Association and Mr. Jochum, please.
Thank you, Chair and committee members. I'm grateful for the opportunity to appear before this committee. My name is Günther Jochum. I farm about 20 minutes west of Winnipeg with my wife and daughter. I'm also president of the Wheat Growers Association. We are a volunteer-based farm advocacy organization dedicated to developing ag policy solutions that strengthen the profitability and sustainability of farming and the agricultural industry. The average age of Canadian producers is over 55 years old, and over 98% of those farms are owned and operated by Canadian farm families. We are very concerned about the changes to the capital gains inclusion rate announced through Budget 2024. While we acknowledge the proposed increase to the lifetime capital gains exemption to $1.25 million, which recognizes the accelerating appreciation of farmland values, we are concerned, however, that the introduction of a 2/3 inclusion rate on capital gains makes it more expensive for young farmers like my daughter Fiona to take over the family farm. As farmers retire over the next decade, many of these farms will be transferred to the next generation. While this will secure retirement for thousands of farmers, the transfer will also incur capital gains. Under the proposed changes, nearly every grain farm across Canada will be impacted by a 2/3 capital gains inclusion rate. This is because the $1.25 million lifetime capital gains exemption is too low to account for rapidly appreciating farm values, and many will have already expended their exemption by the time they sell their farm, meaning most farms will have gains subject to the 2/3 inclusion rate. Furthermore, most Canadian grain farms are structured as corporations and do not benefit from the 50% inclusion rate for the first $250,000 of capital gains. When I consulted my tax accountants, he estimated that I will pay 30% more taxes. These numbers are staggering, and if the capital gains inclusion rate is increased for family farms, it will impose a substantial tax burden on new farmers such as my daughter Fiona at the beginning of their careers. Budget 2024 emphasized fairness for every generation, and yet the proposed changes to capital gains exacerbate farm transfer challenges and make these transfers more expensive for the next generation of young farmers. Furthermore, Budget 2024 described that differences in taxation rates between income earned from wages, capital gains, and dividends currently favor the wealthiest among us. This policy inadvertently targets farmers who produce food to meet domestic and global demand, and as small businesses that are family-run, they do not represent the wealthiest among us. General succession planning is a cornerstone in the agri-food sector, particularly farming. Currently, less than 1% of Canadians are involved in farming, a percentage that is likely to decrease over time. By making farming financially less attractive, the number of farms will continue to dwindle, leading to greater consolidation and fewer family-owned farms. Farmers are known for their ingenuity and entrepreneurial spirit, and many have accumulated significant assets. However, farmers are often asset-rich and cash-poor, meaning they possess valuable assets such as farmland, quota, equipment, and livestock, but lack liquid cash. This becomes especially challenging with changes to the capital gains taxes. Often farmers sell a portion of their land or assets to facilitate intergenerational farm transfer, and they might realize a substantial capital gain, forcing them into difficult financial positions, requiring them to find ways to generate the necessary funds to meet fiscal obligations. Increased capital gains taxes could complicate estate planning and succession, as the tax burden on asset transfers may be higher, which could lead to more family farms being sold off or broken up to pay taxes. All this flies in the face of what Budget 2024 calls fairness for every generation. Thank you for your consideration.
Well, thank you, Mr. Yoakum. And now, members, witnesses, we're moving into members' questions time. And in the first round of questions, each party will have up to 6 minutes to ask you questions. We're starting with MP Morantz for the first 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, I want to thank all the witnesses for being here. Mr. Stefanik, I particularly want to thank you for being here. It's always nice to have a fellow Winnipegger at committee. And I remember very well when you phoned me, you and I had never spoken before or even met. You phoned me, I think, just a couple days after the budget was tabled. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, and your concern was over the increase in the capital gains inclusion rate. And when you bought your business, you were basically, looking for a way to work hard and save for your retirement to make sure that you had a secure retirement and life for your family. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
And you don't have a public sector pension like members of parliament get or high-paid civil servants get. Is that right?
No.
Yeah, and your only source of retirement income is the money you've accumulated in your company. That's right?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah. And the company owns a building, I think. Is that right as well?
Yeah, that was part of the purchase, yeah.
Yeah. And so one of the things that I think is inherently unfair, and I think we heard one of the other witnesses talk about this, it's ironic that the budget was called Fairness for Every Generation, but it's not so fair for your generation. You decided to incorporate when you bought your business, and the policy that the government's putting forward actually excludes corporations from the $250,000 exemption at 50%. Do you think that's fair?
Absolutely not. I mean, I should have stayed a sole proprietor. The whole thing is you plan for the future based on what is current. I have a problem with people talking about this tax being something that the one lady about billionaires. I mean, I'm not a billionaire. Like, I am boots on the ground, hardworking Canadian. I feel that when politicians talk, they're talking about myself. But when someone's trying to use a narrative to state their case with regards to studies and surveys and reports, I can tell you, there's a lot of people in my situation that are your next door neighbor. And it's frustrating to all heck because it makes when you start talking surveys, reports, that tells me that you haven't lived my life. And I'm sitting here listening to it, and it's frustrating. It's very frustrating.
I hear you, and I'm hoping my colleagues on the Liberal side and NDP and Bloc side of this committee are hearing you as well. Now, one of the things that's interesting is that the finance minister said, well, they made it sound like it wasn't that big a deal. Only 0.13% of Canadians are going to be hurt by the increase in this inclusion rate for the capital gains. Do you consider yourself to be among the wealthiest 0.13% of Canadians?
No, definitely not.
No, and this is going to.
I'm sitting here working.
Yeah, yeah, and when it comes time for you to sell your business, your building, the investments that you've saved up for your retirement, you'll wind up paying tax at the 2/3 inclusion rate. and your plan was based on the 50% inclusion rate. So do you kind of feel like the rug's been pulled out from under you?
Well, I feel like, you know, everybody in my age category that did an alternate pathway, didn't work hard and buy a business and you know, gainful employed people to get ahead, it's going to retire before me, and I'm going to have to work longer. It just, you talk about fairness. It's just not fair. It doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't make sense. I think it's that people have lost touch there. I don't think they really understand how many people are in like me there.
And do you feel unfairly targeted by this change?
Well, I mean, it just, I mean, targeted. I'm not sure I'm targeted. However, I do believe it's unfair. And I just think if they actually knew, if they wanted to call and talk to me about it, I can explain to them my thoughts and my journey.
Yeah. Well,
and it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah. And you're doing a very good job of that right now, by the way, and it really matters. Now, just out of curiosity, you know, one of the things about business people is that they're risk takers. And, you know, you may want to grow your business or had plans to grow your business. Do you think that increasing the price you're going to have to pay on your gains to the federal government is going to make you more or less inclined to make further investments in your business?
No, it stifles. You know, it doesn't make sense for me. Why should I put more effort in and take more risk only to pay more taxes? It makes no sense. Like, I don't have, you know, like I say, I don't have an economic background. I don't read reports on a regular basis. I just understand, you know, being the person here working hard. I started out right sweeping the floors and all the way up. And it just seems like now, what did I do that for? I have no words really. And thanks very much for listening, everybody. And I am open to talk to anybody offline if they want to, that is actually making this change, just to realize that the effect that you're having on people and families.
Thank you, Mr. Stefanik. Appreciate it, and I'm sure there'll be more questions. That's the time. MP Morantz and MP Sorbara, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here this morning on a very, very important discussion that we're having. I'd like to start off with Mr. Stanford and Jim. Welcome to you. In your comments, you use the words of both a fairer Canada and a healthier Canada. And from my understanding, a fairer Canada would mean a tax system that is more neutral and efficient, and a healthier Canada would mean that the choices that we've made as a government to invest in dental care, pharmacare, early learning and childhood, national program of $10 daycare, and the Canada Child Benefit and other programs, that to me means a healthier Canada. And I wanted you to comment with regards to those two themes that you brought up in your remarks.
Thank you, sir, for that question. Well, I'm glad that you picked up on those two words. I chose them carefully for that exact reason. We aren't just discussing a tax measure in isolation. The purpose of our tax system is to fund government's ability to sustainably support the programs that government delivers. And the additional revenues that will come from this reform and how we treat capital gains are clearly intended to support the additional program initiatives that were also announced in the budget. And I think several of those are very important, both for a stronger economy, but a healthier one, as you note. So school lunches, for example, is a program where Canada is one of the only industrial countries in the world that provides no assistance for school lunches, particularly for families from low incomes. That is clearly going to improve both physical and mental health. The dental care program, which is rolling out, obviously with the leadership of your NDP colleagues, is clearly going to improve health among the older Canadians and lower income Canadians. And the reports that we're receiving from millions of people signing up for that program indicate clearly that it's meeting an unmet need. We could say the same thing about the disability benefit, some of the affordable housing measures, et cetera. Those programs are associated with revenue flows, expenses that are, I think, modest in the grand scheme of the federal budget and the overall economy, but important. And in order to meet the government's fiscal targets at the same time, they have to be funded. So
Yes. No,
in that regard, the connection between the two is important.
Thank you, Jim. And look, I want to put on the record as an economist and someone who spent over 20 years of both in working on Wall Street and Bay Street, I look at the change in the capital gains inclusion rate as the right thing to do. And if you look at what the IMF has stated, and just to put this on the record, the inclusion rate change improves the tax system neutrality with respect to different forms of capital income and is likely to have no significant impact on investment or productivity growth. And following that, you can read the remarks from the University of Toronto's professor Michael Smart, professor of taxation and economics, University of Toronto. I've often argued we needed to change or go away with a thing called surplus stripping. It's basically a tax avoidance strategies where folks take advantage of the differential tax rates in their system. So a tax system needs to be neutral, efficient, fair, and progressive. This change in the capital gains inclusion rate, not the effective tax rate, but the inclusion rate, moves us in that step. And when you choose as a government and showing responsible leadership, this is actually the right thing to do from a tax system to make it more neutral, efficient, fair, and progressive, and to help middle-class Canadians and seniors. 2 million seniors have signed up and been approved for our dental care program. More than 200,000 have gone to see the dentist. Pharmacare, diabetes medication, contraceptives for women, childcare, the national food benefit, things that Canadians need and use every day. Now, I would like to go to Mr. Stefanovic, if I pronounce your name correctly. Thank you for opening your business. Thank you for being in the trades. My understanding you're in the plumbing business. With regards to, in Canada, we have a small business taxation, a very favorable rate of 9% that small businesses enjoy. And that is something we reduced from 11 to 9% in the early part of our mandate. In addition, you are aware, sir, with regards to a corporation, you'll have different forms of income in your corporation. You'll have interest if you invest in that way, dividends. But you'll also have the opportunity to use the registered retirement savings plans and TSFAs for your retirement. I just wanted to confirm with you that you have used like an RRSP program or TSFA program to also fund your retirement. Is that correct, sir?
As a small business owner, we basically look how things work out at the end of the year. And if there is some money left over, then it's usually reinvested. However, a small portion would be towards retirement. On the personal side, because I'm an employee, because it's a corporation, I'm an employee of my business. So I happen to, just like everybody else, pay my tax under my bracket, and basically I'm able to use that for RSPs, is provided that my family's taken care of and all the bills are paid. So it's no different than probably yourself or what have you. The only thing is I'm not a public servant of any sort. It's all private. That's all. Does that answer your question? Sorry if I...
No. You've done a great job answering the question. I wish to thank you for being here. Your testimony, I appreciated it. But we really need to understand, small business corporations in Canada have a tax rate of 9%. You do, when you running a corporation, when you do pull money out of the corporation, and you decide what amount you wish to pull out at the end of the year, then you make your decisions investing in your RRSP, your TSFA, reinvesting in your business and growing it, of course. And I love to hear that as well. And I think, and then turning over to this. Oh, are we done?
Yeah, we're reached the time. Yeah, so that's
Thank you.
it. So we're going to go now to MP Sainte-Marie for questions, and MP Sainte-Marie.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président. Salutations.
Thank you very much, Chair, and greetings to all the witnesses. This is an issue that we want to look at very closely. And unfortunately, the measure is coming into effect next week, but the bill itself won't be studied until next fall, and that is a great misfortune. I don't know if Professor Godbout has noted that that is the case. The Conservatives increased the rate of inclusions to 60%. The Liberals dropped it to 50%, and so you can see that the roles seem to be reversed this time. My question is for Mr. Godbout. Thank you for being with us. First of all, very often they say for capital gains, there's an inclusion rate that is under 100% to be fairer, because the capital gains have to be weighed against combating inflation. What do you think of this type of argument, and what would be a fair rate if that were the case? Well, you can hear it said that there is a preferential rate in terms of capital gains, taking into account the price of the sale and inflation. It is true if you sell after a year. It's true if it's less true if you sell after, say, 12 years. But on the other hand, the advantage is not just the disposal of the capital gains. An employee pays every 2 weeks on their check. They're taxed, and you can put that off in terms of years. So in terms of inflation, that has to be taken into consideration. Now, we could have integrated it better. If the sale were to be within 12 months, it could have been exempted, and the rate of inclusion could be whole over the 12 months. I don't want to add to the general confusion, but that does exist in other jurisdictions. Thank you. Other questions were asked around the table here a few minutes ago. The government wants to target 0.13% of the richest people, who represent 40,000 people in actual fact. These 40,000 people every year, if you look at it in terms of the average family, they would be included in the richest for 1 year, but not the following year. I'm wondering if you have done any longitudinal studies on this matter. Do you know what percentage of people who would be targeted by this for other income years, if they, say, don't fall into the category now of the 0.13%? Well, I don't have statistics in front of me, but I can speak generally to this. Over a long period, if you look at it over that long period, they are taxed one time. So there is, Mr. Stanford talked about it strongly concentrate on the rich, but they're going to become richer slowly in terms of statistics. If you, there has to be some nuance brought to the issue. There are a certain number of people who, say, only fall into that category once and once only. But I can tell you, with respect to the stats on the richest, it's usually at the time of the year of death. It is a way of redistributing wealth at that time in terms of future generations, because even if the people who are deceased are no longer taxpayers, they are actually contributing over a given year's time to the future. This is the calculation that we have made. Yes, thank you. I think that will help us better study the issue. For small and medium-sized businesses now, exemptions that are in place. Let's turn to that. The first one $1.25 million excluded from capital gains is indexed. Now, if I've understood correctly, an extra $2 million would have an inclusion rate of 33%, and that would be an incentive for entrepreneurs. In terms of the Ways and Means motion, we don't have it. We just have a draft of it, hopefully by the end of June. I think that would be just for the founding shareholder, the person who actually founded the business. That supplementary amount would not necessarily pass on to the other proprietors if the business were sold. So I want to hear your comments on this. This $1.25 million. I think that would be advantageous for those who get a capital gains exemption of about $25 million. I don't know if you've done this type of computation. Well, thank you for your question. Mr. Stefanik, it could apply to him. Say he has a $1,250,000 that is free of tax at the time. But if he adds the spouse, that increases. Therefore, you can multiply the amounts to $1.25 million. Now, with the change in capital gains, it was supposed to be $1 million this year in 2024, and the day after, June 25th, it would be the $25 million, as you've pointed out. As a Canadian incentive, it could be more restrictive because it is limited to the founding shareholder, the person who founded the business. The others would not be entitled. And I don't know how the bill will read finally, but you can't multiply it in terms of people who buy into the business. So it's limiting. So they're going to offer a rate which is half the rate of inclusion. If it's 67, we will go to 35%. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, MP Samari, and now to MP Davies, please.
Thank you, Ms. Brusk, and maybe to Mr. Cochrane and Senator the Economist as well for the CLC. You touched on this, Ms. Brusk, but in April 2024, Mr. Cochrane, you co-authored a report titled Canada's Shift to a More Regressive Tax System, 2004 to 2022, which found that in 2022, the total tax rate for the lowest household income decile, it's the bottom 10%, was 35%, whereas the total tax rate for the top 1% was 24%. Moreover, the report found that the top 5% of Canadians paid a lower rate in 2022 than the bottom 95% of Canadians, with the top 1% paying an even lower rate. Can you explain why Canada's tax system imposes a higher total tax rate on the bottom 95% of households versus the top 5%?
Can I explain the why?
Yeah.
No, because there's no justification. There is zero justification for that. It's completely contrary to how our tax system is supposed to work. So the why? No, I can't answer.
How would you characterize that situation?
Incredibly unfair and, frankly, deleterious to every aspect of our society.
Thank you. Mr. Jokum, thank you for farming. My grandfather farmed from 1926 to 1960, was a grain farmer on the border of Alberta and Saskatchewan. Thank you for growing our country's food. I want to talk to you a little bit about family farms. Now, my understanding is that in this budget, it would increase the lifetime capital gains exemption on the sale of family farms from $1 million to $1.25 million. Are you aware of that?
Yes, I am.
And I understand that also when you sell a farm, you also can benefit from the principal residence deduction, meaning that you can eliminate entirely from capital gains your home and 1.24 acres in addition, so that's completely tax-free. Are you aware of that, sir?
Yes, I am. However, it doesn't always work that way in family farm transfer. And that's what I'm really concerned about. Our daughter came back from working in the ag industry, and we're in a process of family farm transfer, and this new tax will add a lot of tax
That's what I'm trying to explore.
implications.
Now,
So.
I know that when we put assets in joint ownership, then that property passes, it simply would avoid tax and disposition at all. Could you add your daughter's name as a joint owner to the farm and avoid that disposition entirely?
That I'm not sure of. I would have to check that out with my accountant.
Okay.
And we're working on that. I am a farmer, not a tax lawyer.
Of course, no, I appreciate that.
I did call him before this meeting here today, and he said, absolutely, it will increase my tax burden going forward.
So just two other quick questions. I understand, and we'll get into this with another witness on stacking. If you were passing your farm to 3 children, each of those children could add cumulatively their capital gains exemptions. Were you aware of that, sir? You maybe only have the one daughter, is that right?
No, we have 4 daughters, but
So if you were
it's
to
only the one daughter that's interested in farming.
Right. But if you were to transfer your farm to 4 of your children, are you aware that those 4 people can cumulatively stack their capital gains exemptions? So in this case, it would be a total of $5 million of lifetime exemption.
Right. So I was not aware of that. However, spreading it out to non-farming family members, like the other kids, is a pretty surefire way of destroying the family farm.
Yeah, no, I'm not suggesting that. I'm not suggesting your personal situation. I'm talking about just the structure of it. Finally, I don't know if you're aware, but when capital gains were imposed in this country or brought in this country in 1972, the rate was 50%. In 1988, the Mulroney Conservative government raised it to 66.6%. And in 1990, they raised it again to 75%. Today, this proposal would actually bring it back to the 50% rate that still was in place in 1972, but raise to 66.6% only on that amount over $250,000. Are you suggesting, sir, that we should go back to the 1972 rates in this country?
I'm suggesting that this budget is not fair to generational to multi-generational farms. And my farm is my retirement. Just like Mrs. Stefanik said, I don't have a fancy RSP because I invested everything into my farm. And now I get penalized for doing that versus you yourself or some of my other kids who have very good jobs, pay into an RSP, their employer pays into an RSP, and yet they do not face this tax increase.
Well, sir, you will be left with 33% of your capital gain is still tax-free. So you'll still retain that benefit. Mr. Stanford, can you please explain the stacking, the way that stacking might work under this new provision? I'll give you an example. Many people are concerned how this might affect a second property, rental property, a second home. In the case of couples where secondary residence is 50% owned by each spouse, each of them is entitled to $250,000 exemption, making a $500,000 exemption. Same thing with the farm. Can you explain that to us?
Well, since the capital gains on the individual personal tax return is defined according to each individual, not according to a family or a household, that's how our tax system works, then each individual claiming a capital gains will be able to access all of those exemptions and thresholds. So that includes the 1.25 million lifetime exemption for farms and small business, could go to each member of a family. And then the annual $250,000 threshold before you move into the 66% inclusion rate could also be claimed by each member of a family. So a good example would be a cottage. We hear a lot about cottage owners and a cottage that's in the family. Well, if it is in the family, and owned jointly, then that $250,000 threshold could apply each year for each individual in the family. On top of that, we of course have a bit of an income averaging system in our capital gains system, the capital gains reserve, which generally will allow you to average out one-time capital gains over 5 years, or in the case of passing property to your children, even longer. So the stackability across members of a family and the potential for averaging over multiple years means that most people with a second home are going to be able, I think, to avoid the 66% inclusion rate entirely and continue to pay capital gains at the existing 50% rate.
Thank you, MP Davies. That's the time. Members, we're moving into our second round of questions. Times are a little bit different in this round, and we're starting with MP Lawrence for 5 minutes.
Thank you. And I'll just start by just correcting a little bit of incorrect tax advice that Mr. Davies offered from the floor here. Number one, simply by putting in a property...
Point of order, I wasn't giving tax advice, just to be clear.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Davies. Simply by putting something in joint tenancy does not avoid, or putting someone in joint name, it actually triggers the tax at that point. And in fact, stacking would work for the next generation, which means his kids could multiply the capital gains exemption, but he cannot unless his wife also owns the corporation. So just I would strongly advise that Mr. Davies maybe perhaps review the tax law before he starts making commentary. Now, I'm also struck by the fact that we have a series of individuals who get their money either from government or are tenured or otherwise, who are making pronouncements about the lives of business owners. And we actually have business owners here who directly contradict what they've said. And I think anyone at home would be well aware of the facts here. We've heard from a tenured professor that, no, this won't discourage business investment. We've heard from business owners that, in fact, it will reduce tenure, or that it will reduce their investment in businesses. This is costing people jobs. This is costing people real lives. This is hurting people financially. Mr. Joachim, my first questions will be for you, sir. You talked a little bit about the effect of the tax changes. I want to go back a little bit. And first of all, if you don't mind sharing me, does your family farm pay carbon tax?
Yes, we do. We pay, there are certain segments that are exempt, but there's a lot of hidden carbon tax that's paid. About 75 to 85% of what I produce is exported, and it is transported on the Canadian rail system, either CP or CN, and they pay carbon tax on the fuel that they use, and they do pass it on to the farmer. The same with the grain elevators that receive our grain, and anything they use within their system and adds cost, that would be the carbon tax, is again passed on to the farmer. Mm-hmm. So there's lots of hidden carbon tax that we pay that is not a line item within our bookkeeping, but it is there. So and APAS did a great study out of Saskatchewan as far as how much carbon tax we pay, and it's staggering.
Thank you very much. And so now this Liberal government is adding insult to injury to farmers. So in addition to the thousands of dollars, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars of carbon tax, they're now increasing the capital gains inclusion. And the capital gains inclusion from the advice that you've received from your tax professionals is that it will increase your tax burden and make it more difficult to pass a family farm onto your daughter. Is that your understanding?
That is correct. My farm is my retirement, and a family transfer, farm transfer, is a very difficult job to do to satisfy everyone's need within the family. My parents moved from Germany to Canada in 1980. We had a very small farm in Germany. We bought a smaller than average size farm here in Manitoba back in 1980. And I came back from university to the farm in 1984. And on the advice of my accountant, I did pay a little bit into RSPs, but he said, you're better off investing in your farm because you want to grow it where the farm is financially viable to support your family. And so we have grown it over the last 44 years into a larger than average size farm, which supports 3 households at the moment. We have done that when I was married. We lived for 12 years in a house, had very little furniture, made lots of sacrifices to grow the farm. And we grew the farm not in order to sell it at the end of my farming career and live in luxury with the millions. No, we grew
Thank
the
you,
farm.
sir. Thank you.
So
Thank
that
you. I'm
we
just running out of
pass it
time.
on.
I'm running out of time. And
Right.
I would like to just seek unanimous consent for this committee to agree that farmers and plumbers should be exempted from the capital gains legislation.
I'm not saying unanimous consent.
No one said no.
No one said no.
Who said no? Who said no?
Unanimous consent that farmers, union members, and plumbers be exempt from the capital gains inclusion increase. That this commitment makes such a commitment. Do you see?
Just a point of order, Mr. Chair. Is that a motion that we would need notice for?
I'm asking for unanimous consent.
I'll
Still
just
a motion.
suspend for a second. So, yes, you can ask for unanimous consent. No. Okay, we'll continue. And we are off to MP Thompson, please.
Thank you, and thank you to all the witnesses. Mr. Stanford, are there any inaccuracies that you've heard in the previous couple of rounds that you'd like to speak to or correct?
I guess one thing I might try to elaborate a little bit is the question of the impact of capital gains inclusion on capital investment by businesses. Machinery and investment decisions, machinery and equipment decisions by companies are based on their judgment that the business will be profitable going forward, and the capital gains, the relevance of the capital gains inclusion rate to that decision is not at all clear. The capital gains will result at the end from perhaps selling the business or selling shares in the business, but growing a profitable business that you think can meet a need and generate a return on investment itself isn't subject to capital gains. So when you buy a new piece of machinery, you're adding to the asset value of the company. You're hopefully generating new revenue and profit from that. And as long as that company continues, then this change will have no impact on you.